Hey there, ladies and gentlemen. We're back for another fun episode that will follow the hunt for the Forbidden Scrolls. Will we get an answer on those bald guys already? They're becoming more and more prevalent, but to what end? Asuma has returned to the village at long last. I wonder what new role he'll take on. Maybe another addition to the Anbu. Maybe he'll become a teacher for Konohamaru. Whatever he ends up doing, his strength and wisdom are an absolute asset for the village. Remember to please comment, like, and subscribe if you're liking what I'm doing here, and help get word out to people who like long-form storytelling. On with the show. The ruins of Iwa's former foe capital stretched beneath him, the graveyard of an old war turned into something greater. Dosu Kanuta stood atop a fractured tower, his full gauntlets catching the dim evening light, the vibrations humming faintly under his fingertips. The air smelled of stone and dust, but also of progress, the scent of something new being built over the old. For years, the sound had been scattered, fleeting, a ghost of an empire, but not anymore. Dosu let his gaze sweep across the village, or rather, what had become of it. In just the past 6 months, the sound had transformed. What was once a desolate, crumbling ruin had been reforged into something living, something rising. The streets were no longer empty. The foundations of stronger walls and reinforced buildings stretched across the landscape. Recruitment efforts had finally paid off. Men and women from the farthest reaches of the world, those who had no place in their former villages or abandoned by their own nations, had come to them. And now, the sound was growing. A low thrum of chakra pulsed through his head, a sensation he had long since grown used to. It wasn't something he often acknowledged, but in moments like this, he could feel it, the slow, quiet stir of power buried under the surface. Not yet needed, but always waiting. Beneath the bandages, he grinned. The sound had suffered for years. Their officers had dwindled in number, whittled down by war, by betrayal, by time. But now that they had finally stabilized, Lord Orochimaru was seeking new blood. New recruits, new warriors, new officers. That was the way forward. That was how they would finally assert their place in the world. Currently, they were few but strong. Dosu himself, Tayuya, Sakon and Ukon, Kidomaru, and Jugo, the monster. They had once had Kimimaro, but he was gone. Not in the way one would expect. Kimimaru's body remained, but he did not. Lord Orochimaru had taken it for himself. The dead had returned, but not in any way Dosu had expected. Kimimaro had once led them, and Dosu hated it. The man was strong, undeniably strong, but too passive, too reserved. Dosu had not forgotten the shame of the Chunin exams. When Zaku died in the Forest of Death, Dosu had fully intended to finish the mission, to carry on and claim victory for the Sound. But Kimimaro had withdrawn. One teammate fallen, so they fled? It was pathetic, cowardly, weak. Dosu's fingers tightened around his gauntlets, a familiar bitterness crawling up his throat. The Sound had been humiliated that day. But now, things were different. With Orochimaru in power once more, they were finally building, strengthening, preparing. Kimimaru's passivity had died with him. Orochimaru had consumed him, taken his body for his own, reforging himself into something stronger than ever. A perfect vessel. A perfect leader. And to Dosu, that was nothing but good news. The wind shifted, and something flickered at the edge of his vision. Dosu stilled. Leaf Ninja. His one visible eye narrowed, his teeth clenching behind his mask. They moved with arrogance, flickering past the rooftops with the kind of ease that sickened him. They didn't hide themselves, they didn't hesitate. They moved as if they belonged here. His blood boiled. How many times had Konoha's shinobi stepped into the Sound's lands without fear? How many times had they entered these ruins as if they were unclaimed territory? Far too many. They thought they could walk Sound's land like it was theirs? They thought they could fly past their borders unchallenged? They were wrong. Dosu flexed his fingers. His gauntlets hummed in response. The vibrations a soft whisper, but ready to amplify. Without a single sound, he pushed off the rooftop, disappearing into the city below. He wasn't going to stop them. Not yet. He was going to follow. And when the time came, they would learn the cost of their arrogance. The trees blurred past them in streaks of green and brown, towering sentinels stretching skyward, their thick branches tangled overhead like clasped hands. The leaf shinobi moved with practiced grace, leaping between the trunks, pushing off sturdy branches, their footfalls light despite their urgency. The forests of the Land of Fire were vast, but this region, dense and ancient, was something else entirely. The canopy was thick, filtering sunlight into fragmented golden beams, illuminating patches of undergrowth and shifting pools of light. The scent of damp bark and rich earth clung to the air, mixing with the faint musk of moss and distant river water. Birds took startled flight as the four ninja passed, their wings cutting through the silence like blades. Despite their speed, the tension in the air was suffocating. Shikamaru, of course, led the formation, his expression unreadable as he processed the battle ahead. Karin trailed slightly behind, her crimson hair whipping behind her, her movements fluid but impatient. Tenten and Shino kept pace, their breath steady, their minds already primed for battle. They weren't sneaking into enemy territory. This was an inevitable confrontation. The bald men knew they were being pursued, and that meant there was no advantage of surprise. There would be blood. Shikamaru exhaled sharply, breaking the silence. We need to talk strategy. No one slowed their pace, but they adjusted their attention. He didn't waste time with preamble. I don't have the stamina or the technique to be in the middle of the fight, he continued. And Karin, you're the medic. If we take a hit, you need to be able to patch us up, which means you're out of direct combat. Karin scoffed, but didn't argue. Shikamaru ignored her attitude and pressed on, gesturing towards Tenten. That means you're the bruiser. You need to stay on them, keep them locked in combat, and don't let them get the space to use anything too destructive. Tenten didn't look back at him, her focus already locked on the path ahead. With my Hiramakere, I should be able to keep them on their toes. The real issue is making sure I don't get overwhelmed by their ranged attacks. That's where I come in. Shino's voice was calm, even with the wind rushing past them. My insects will suppress ranged assaults. If they try to create distance, I'll keep them occupied. Shikamaru nodded, exactly what he was expecting. He then turned his attention to Karin. Since your taijutsu is, garbage. Karin snapped her gaze to him with a glare. Excuse me? Shikamaru sighed and rubbed the back of his head. Look, I'm just stating the obvious, no offense. You said it offensively, she muttered. We don't have time for this, Shino cut in sharply. Karin, you know you're not suited for a head-on fight. Just let it go. Karin scowled, crossing her arms but not outright refusing the plan. Fine, whatever. Shikamaru exhaled slowly. She's a handful. Anyway, since your taijutsu is, let's say, not the best, we need you focusing on sealing jutsu and support. If we can pin one of them down, you lock them in place. Karin rolled her eyes. I was planning on doing that anyway? Shikamaru suppressed a groan. Glad we're on the same page. Shino interjected smoothly, pulling their focus back to the mission. This outpost they've stationed themselves in may be beyond our border, but it's still deep in our familiar forest. That means we're the ones with the home advantage. He's right, Tenten added. We know how to maneuver in the forests better than anyone. That's something we can use. Shikamaru thought fast, his mind already mapping the battle. We can use the trees for cover, force them to perhaps split their focus. They have this time of waiting to mount a capable defense, but if we burn through it fast, we can force mistakes. Doesn't mean they won't be a pain, Karin muttered. They stole the damn scrolls for a reason. Shikamaru glanced at her. You don't seem surprised. Karin narrowed her eyes. People always think they can take what they don't understand. Shikamaru let her words settle before turning back to Tenten. Since you're the frontline fighter, you'll also be in the greatest danger. She nodded. With Shino covering me, I have full confidence I can handle whatever's left. And I will cover you, Shino assured her. I'll be mid-range support. My insects can adapt to anything. Shikamaru nodded. Good. And me? I'll be locking their movements down with my shadows. If I can pin one, you all focus on the others. They've been after our secrets before and failed. They might be even more desperate this time. If we can get one alive, great, but don't plan around for that. The last time we had one, he released one word to us, and it took so long to reveal it, it was nearly useless. What word was it? Tenten asked as they ran, Karin's head tilting to hear. All he said was, Shisui, Shikamaru revealed, grimacing. I probably shouldn't have said that, but Shisui was only ever attached to the Akatsuki. I've never heard of Akatsuki with these guys. Did you catch word of that messenger bird that arrived from Kakashi? Shino asked. Word had spread of a message from Team Kakashi that had infiltrated the Land of Rain. They had yet to arrive back home, but the rumor mill made sure to let everyone in the village know that something about a particular messenger bird was important. Yeah, Shikamaru muttered, his words too quiet to reach them. The note was indeed from Kakashi, and it really bothered him that such important information had found its way around the village. Luckily, no one seemed to know its contents, though, so it wasn't a full leak. No one on the team was particularly close with Sasuke, so Shikamaru was confident they wouldn't be distracted by what contents the note contained. Blinking and shaking his head, Shikamaru returned focus on the path ahead and what was coming for them. The plan was solid. They all knew it, but battle was never simple. They burst through a final stretch of dense bush, the ground sloping downward, revealing their destination. A stone outpost sat nestled in the clearing, half hidden by thick roots and vines, its structure weathered but sturdy. The bald men were there, waiting. The forest had fallen silent. Even the birds had fled. The fight was coming. There was no turning back. The forest had gone still. Not even the wind stirred through the leaves now, and the silence pressed in like a heavy weight, unnatural and thick. For a moment, the only sound was the slow, measured breaths of the four shinobi as they came to a halt just beyond the tree line. The outpost sat ahead, half buried in the landscape, a structure of aged stone, covered in creeping moss and thick tree roots, as if the forest itself had tried to reclaim it. Shikamaru held up a hand, fingers splayed in a silent command to stop. Tenten, Shino, and Karin froze instantly, falling into crouches, blending into the thick undergrowth. From their position, the outpost seemed quiet. Too quiet. The bald men knew they were coming. That meant this wasn't an ordinary infiltration. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. Shikamaru exhaled slowly. The first step was gathering intel. He motioned to Shino first, who gave a slight nod before pressing a hand against his sleeve. The faintest rustle of movement followed as his Kakaichu scattered, flowing unseen through the undergrowth. They moved like a silent tide, splitting off in multiple directions, slipping through cracks in the stone walls, crawling through door frames, seeking movement. Shikamaru turned to Tenten next, who had already drawn a small spyglass from her pouch. She adjusted the lens, scanning the outpost for openings, weak points, or movement inside. Karin, meanwhile, sat cross-legged in the underbrush, closing her eyes. Sensor mode. Her chakra pulsed outward in a soft, invisible wave, feeling for the energy signals inside. The team remained in total silence, waiting for information. Karin's brow furrowed as the chakra inside the outpost came into focus. 5, maybe 6 of them. No, there were definitely 6. But something was off. Their chakra levels were unnatural. Based on the report she had heard about their previous capture attempt, the bald people were rather unremarkable. But the chakra levels these ones exhibited were easily Jonin level. Karin clenched her jaw. That couldn't have been normal. She opened her eyes and gave Shikamaru a meaningful look, whispering, "They have insane chakra levels compared to us. They're not just a bunch of thieves." Whatever's happening in there, or has happened, or might be happening, they're stronger than they should be. Shikamaru did not react outwardly, but she saw the way his fingers flexed slightly against his knee, processing, recalculating. Moments later, Shino's insects returned. He spoke in a whisper, voice steady. My insects confirm 6 individuals inside. They are stationary, likely expecting an attack. No movement? Tenten murmured. None, Shino said. But something else. His brow furrowed slightly. There are tags placed at every entry point. Seals, most likely. They seem recently placed. Traps. Shikamaru felt a knot tighten in his stomach. As expected, they're prepared. Tenten finished adjusting her spyglass, murmuring, They're holed up well. Every window and door has been sealed off, and the only way in is through the front gate. She lowered the spyglass, eyes narrowing. But, if we go in straight, we're, of course, walking into an ambush. You Leaf Ninja aren't too bright, Karin muttered, arms crossed. That much is obvious. State things we don't know. Tenten ignored her, focusing on Shikamaru. There's no high ground either. The trees are too far from the walls, so we don't have an angle for ranged attacks unless we force them outside. Shikamaru tapped a finger against his knee, thinking fast. Then, that's the move. He turned back to the group, his voice low. We can't go in blind. Our best chance is to force them into open combat, not a siege. He looked at Tenten and Shino. We bait them out, force them into the clearing. Tenten, you take point and pressure them. Shino, you keep her covered from range. Shino nodded. Understood. Shikamaru looked at Karin next. Your job is control. If we separate one, lock them down with a seal, no mistakes. Karin gave an unimpressed look. Gee, thanks for the faith. Shikamaru exhaled sharply, already tired of this. Look, I trust your skills, but you're reckless in every way that you speak. Don't get ahead of yourself. Karin scowled but said nothing. Tenten, he continued. You said Hiramakere gives you the advantage. You still confident? Tenten tightened her grip on the bandaged twin sword strapped to her back. They won't be able to match me in close quarters. Shikamaru nodded. Then that's what we'll do. We'll flush them out, control the field, and take them apart. No heroics, we keep each other alive. The team exchanged brief glances. No hesitation. They understood. This wasn't a mission where they could afford mistakes. Shikamaru exhaled slowly and gave the final order. We move in 3 minutes. Get ready. The air was thick with anticipation. They weren't dealing with simple thieves. The bald men were known entities. They had higher than average chakra reserves, and now they had forbidden jutsu. This wasn't just retrieval anymore. It was a battle against virtually unknown forces, and they were walking straight into it. Shikamaru crouched, scanning the dark, silent outpost one last time. He had a sinking feeling in his gut, but it was too late for doubts now. The moment had come. Shikamaru gave the signal, 2 fingers raised, go. They moved as one. Tenten and Shino took point, slipping closer to the stone outpost. Shikamaru and Karin trailed behind, keeping to the tree line, ready to disrupt enemy movement the moment they engaged. The air was thick with anticipation. The forest had been silent for too long. Their mission was simple: encourage movement. Tenten darted forward, kunai flicking from her fingers, tapping against the iron-worn wooden doors. Shino's Kakaichu landed fast and left an explosive tag upon the doors. Triggered from afar, Shino let the tags explode, hoping its following smoke would run them outside. Let them take the bait. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Shikamaru felt the air grow heavier. They should have. Then the opening exploded once more. A shockwave rippled outward, obliterating the entrance completely, sending splinters and black smoke billowing into the clearing. Tenten leaped back, cursing. Damn! Move! The plan had already begun falling apart. Instead of staggered engagement, all 6 bald men exited at once, flowing through the smoke like specters. They weren't rushing. They were calm, methodical, like they had all the time in the world. Shikamaru barely had time to react before one of them swung a hand forward, and from his palm, dozens of flickering projectiles shot forward, and an opened scroll fell to the man's feet with the seal of fire upon it. "Shuriken Shadow Explosion Jutsu!" the man shouted. The first volley of shurikens sailed forward, but the moment they landed on anything, each shadow ignited, birthing a second wave of spinning blades. Shuriken were now firing from two opposite directions, doubling their need to defend. Things had gone from smooth and controlled to chaotic and dangerous immediately. Tenten was already moving, spinning Hiramakere in a wide arc, deflecting the projectiles, but more just kept coming. "Shino!" Karin barked, already shifting beside him. Shino's Kikaichu surged forward, forming a living shield of insects, intercepting the first wave of projectiles. The buzzing mass caught many of the Shadowborn shuriken, but several still whizzed past, slicing through the tree bark and grazing Tenten's jacket. Shikamaru ducked back, a shuriken cutting through his sleeve. Before they could counter, another bald man stepped forward with an unfurled scroll in hand, the fire sigil upon it, and fingers forming a one-handed seal in the other. "Perpetual Darkness Jutsu!" Instantly, Shikamaru's vision collapsed. Not just blackness, nothingness. He took a step back and felt nothing. His instincts screamed Genjutsu. A far distant sound sent ice through his veins. Water. The world shifted. Cold, surging pressure wrapped around his body. "No!" Tenten, seeing Shikamaru go still, knew immediately as well. Genjutsu. But she just didn't have time to snap him out of it. The bald men were not done. They were using the very jutsu they had stolen against them. Two of them lifted their arms, hands flashing through seals. The ground beneath them ruptured and water erupted from nowhere, swallowing the battlefield. "Sunken Kingdom Jutsu!" Tenten jumped back, barely keeping herself from sinking. Shino and Karin weren't as lucky. The earth vanished beneath their feet, replaced by an endless, surging ocean. Karin barely managed a sharp intake of breath before the current pulled her under. She gasped, struggling to right herself, but the water wasn't still. It churned and swirled, dragged her down, making footing impossible. She wasn't the only one, though. Shino reacted instantly, his Kikaichu bursting out from his body, spreading across the water's surface in an attempt to find stability. Karin surfaced, coughing. "Shino!" "I'm here," Shino said, calm despite the chaos. Karin didn't hesitate. They were fighting together now. Shino's Kikaichu weren't built for water combat. The second they hit the surface, the current threatened to wash them away. But Shino was already adjusting. "Karin, I need a chakra anchor," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the raging water. Karin gritted her teeth. She knew exactly what he meant. A quick seal, a pulse of her chakra, and an invisible field spread outward, solidifying the energy around them just enough to keep Shino's insects from scattering. Shino lifted his arm, directing them forward. The insects shot toward the bald men, but before they could make contact, another bald figure flashed through hand seals. A single explosive tag appeared in his hand, and then it multiplied. "Mutually multiplying explosive tags!" Karin's stomach dropped. Shino barely had time to react before the first explosion detonated. Tenten saw the explosion before she heard it, a massive blooming fireball ripping through the battlefield. Karin and Shino were somewhere in that blast. She didn't think, she moved. Hiramakere flashed, cutting through the surge of water as she closed the distance between her and the bald men. The explosion tore through the water, sending shockwaves across the battlefield. The sheer force of it disrupted the already chaotic currents, turning the Sunken Kingdom Jutsu into something even worse, an unstable maelstrom with its swirling water choked by fire and smoke. For a moment, there was no sign of Karin or Shino. Then, a burst of chakra tore through the surface. Karin surged upward first, coughing violently. Her hair was singed at the tips, and the force of the explosion had left a gash along her arm, but she was still conscious, still moving. But where was Shino? Emerged next, floating just beneath the water's surface, unmoving. Crap! She swam to him instantly, grabbing his arm, shaking him. Shino, wake up! Nothing. His body was limp. Her heart pounded. The water around them was turning red. She didn't think, she moved. She thrust her arm into his mouth and pressed it closed onto her. A pulse of chakra rippled from her, and Shino's eyes snapped open. He gasped violently, coughing out a mouthful of water. His body jerked, his muscles spasming as the rush of Karin's life force surged into him. Good. Karin panted, relief flooding her chest. You're still breathing. Shino blinked at her for just a second, disoriented, before he shook himself back to focus. His voice was calm, despite what just happened. That was reckless. Karin scoffed. Shut up and fight! Shino exhaled sharply, then without hesitation, he moved. Shino lifted a hand, his Kikaichu swarming towards him, clinging to his wetted skin, buzzing as if awaiting instruction. Then, his own chakra pulsed. Karin watched as something shifted in the insects' bodies. A single beetle lifted into the air and ignited. This wasn't a kamikaze flight. The bugs were wreathed in flame as if they were always born to the task. Karin's eyes widened. Wait, you... Shino didn't answer. He simply flicked his wrist, sending the first burning Kikaichu flying toward the nearest bald man, standing atop the water's surface. The moment it made contact, the fire crawled from the insect onto the bald man's robes, burning not like a natural flame, but something unnatural, something consuming. The bald man let out a guttural hiss, attempting to slap the fire away, but it clung, spreading, burning through his now chakra-infused clothing like wax under an open flame. Karin, Shino said quietly, support me. Karin didn't need to be told twice. She flashed through hand seals, and with a pulse of genjutsu, she locked her sights on another bald man. If they think their stolen jutsu is the most dangerous thing here, they're about to learn otherwise, Karin said. Tenten wasn't waiting. Her hiramakeri flashed, cutting through water as she closed the distance between herself and her bald man. She wasn't about to let Shino and Karin take all the heat alone. They were 6 bald men, but only one of them had actually attacked her directly, her target. As soon as she was in range, she swung her blade in a wide arc, chakra bursting from the weapon's edge, not just a swing, but an extension, an invisible shockwave traveling with her blade's movement. The bald man jumped back just in time, but Tenten wasn't stopping. With a twist of her wrist, hiramakeri shifted form into a staff that Tenten twirled with ease to keep her opponent guessing. The next strike came faster. The bald man barely blocked, arms coming up as a trick of light caught her attention. Her staff bounced off his arms easily, as if they were made of rubber, surely a defensive jutsu she had not seen him do, and explanation for the flicker of light. Tenten gritted her teeth. He was strong, but she was faster. She shifted her stance, shifting her grip on her staff, twisting midair. Then she dropped her center of gravity and slammed hiramakeri's staff into the water, sending a massive wave crashing forward and engulfing him. The barrier around his body flickered, just for a second, but that was all she needed. Tenten followed through, staff smearing, closing the distance. Shikamaru was still locked into nothingness. He could feel water around him, but he couldn't see, hear, or feel anything else. No sense of movement, no sense of where the others were. He had been completely erased from reality. If it weren't for his rational mind, he would have panicked. But he didn't, because Shikamaru understood one thing about genjutsu. It always had a weakness. Find it. He reached out, not physically, but with chakra. His shadow possession jutsu responded instantly. If the bald men thought blocking his senses would disable him, they had miscalculated. Shikamaru wasn't trapped in darkness, he was simply waiting. Waiting for an opening, waiting for one mistake. And the second he felt one of them move too close, he struck. The battlefield was chaos. Water still churned unnaturally beneath their feet. Fire flickered where Shino's Kikaichu had burned through their enemy's defenses. Yet despite it all, Shikamaru and Tenten saw their openings. Tenten's staff twirled ever still, Hiramakere still pulsing with raw chakra. The bald man before her staggered, his barrier flickering unsteadily after her last devastating swing. This is it. Her muscles burned, but she surged forward, twisting midair, her body moving with the fluid precision of a master weapons user. She brought her staff down, chakra erupting from the impact, shattering the barrier that had barely been holding. For the first time in the fight, her enemy was wide open. She didn't hesitate. Hiramakere shifted again, condensing into a single massive broadsword as she swung forward with everything she had. The blade connected. The bald man barely managed a half-step back, but it was too late. The force cracked his ribs, sending him flying backward, his body skidding violently across the churning water before slamming into a tree. Tenten exhaled, steadying her stance. One down. The blade returned to its original shape, and the chakra that had been coursing through it bled away. Tenten staggered to her knees in exhaustion, eyelids suddenly feeling heavy. No time for this. She turned to help the others, willing herself up once more. The bald man believed he had blinded Shikamaru, but he had been waiting. In his blindness, Shikamaru found an invisible resistance against him, so he struck. The instant his shadow connected, he disconnected the man's hands, dispelling the jutsu. And just like that, Shikamaru was free. He could see. He could breathe, and he wasn't about to waste the opportunity. With a sharp motion, he forced the trapped bald man's body to follow him as he sought to assist his allies. Shino was struggling. His Kikaichu had burned through 2 of their enemy's defenses, but it still wasn't enough. They had all grown very tired, and despite their initial upper hand, the bald men were adapting faster than anticipated. Shino barely ducked to the right, avoiding a strike, but he wasn't fast enough to see the second attack from the left, and it slammed into Karin. Hard. She staggered backward, blood blooming from her side, but her expression didn't change. "Pay attention, bug boy," she hissed, wiping the blood from her lip. Shino barely had time to register the severity of her wound because something was wrong with her. Her stance shifted. For just a moment, it was too relaxed. Not like someone in a life or death fight, but like someone uncertain, like she was hesitating. And then, before Shino could call it out, Karin spoke. We should probably spare them, she advised, wincing against the fresh pain in her side. They are not leaving any option for that, Shino argued, stepping towards Karin, his tall frame shadowing hers. Karin opened her mouth for a moment, but faltered in temporary silence before suddenly pushing Shino and shouting, "Look out!" Tenten was already moving towards Shino and Karin. She cursed her own exhaustion and slowed speed in an attempt to help her allies. She hoped they were having the same amount of success that she had. She turned the corner and froze. A man stood there blocking their path. Not one of the bald men. Someone else. Someone more dangerous. The way he held himself was different. He wasn't frantic like the bald men, nor struggling like her own team. He stood calm, composed, sober, as if he already knew the outcome. He was alone, and it changed nothing. He had one eye that burned red, and another a pale indigo. One Sharingan, one Byakugan. Her body suddenly screamed at her to move, but she was too late. His very presence was terrifying. While Shino made Karin look small, this man made Shino look small. And Ransai moved first, his unarmed hand carved downward, clean and effortless. And Shino's arm went with it. Tenten's breath caught in her throat. It was so fast. Shino barely had time to register what happened. His arm, his right arm, had been there 1 second, and the next, it was gone. Blood splattered onto the water, staining it deep red. Shino didn't even scream. He simply staggered back, staring in disbelief. He took one shallow breath before falling onto his back. Karin's entire body went rigid, and Ransai, standing over them, looked at Karin and spoke. Tenten couldn't hear what he said, but she saw Karin's face, and she had never seen such an expression on her before. Quiet desperation. Tenten finally surged forward, blade raised, heart pounding. No! She swung. Ransai didn't even flinch. With a single effortless strike, he moved past her guard, past her strike, his hand spearing forward. She barely registered the pain before she felt the warmth. She looked down. His hand was through her abdomen. It had gone straight through. Her knees buckled. I didn't see him move. She choked on her own breath, her fingers trembling as her hiramakere slipped from her grasp. Don't take my sword. Ransai pulled his hand free. Blades bore me, Ransai said monotonously. Tenten collapsed. Her vision flickered, and all she could hear were footsteps. The remaining bald men, the very enemies they had been fighting minutes ago, turned and ran. They abandoned the scrolls. They abandoned everything. They just wanted to survive, but Ransai was faster. He caught up to them with ease. Tenten, even in her dazed state, could still hear it. The sound of death, not the clash of battle. Just the sound of clean, precise, inescapable execution. One by one, he struck them down. One by one, they fell. Shikamaru barely had the wherewithal to sever connection before Ransai swiftly took that one out too. And when there was no one left, he turned back. He walked towards the scrolls they had abandoned, picked them up, and vanished. The forest fell silent again. The battle was over, but it didn't feel like a victory. It wasn't a victory. Tenten lay on the ground, bleeding out. Shino clutched his severed arm, shaking. Karin stood frozen, her face now unreadable. And Shikamaru, barely regaining his bearings, took in the sight before him. His mind raced, trying to understand what just happened, who that man was, why the bald men had abandoned everything just to flee from him. All he knew for sure was one thing. This was bigger than them, and they had barely survived it. Bite! Karin instructed to the gravely wounded Tenten. After a moment, Tenten's wound had sealed itself, but Karin had pulled away. Tenten struggled, barely hanging onto consciousness. Karin, what did that man say? You should be good enough to move, Karin said, ignoring Tenten's question and looking Shikamaru over before returning to Shino's side. But, and her voice broke to sadness, I can't bring back an arm. While we regain our energy and perform first aid on Shino, debrief me. Tell me what happened over here, Shikamaru instructed to Karin, leaving Tenten to rest, remembering her question. Who was that guy? Ransai, Karin revealed in a dead tone to Shikamaru, who had only really heard of him. Why didn't he injure you? Shikamaru pressed. And what did he say? Karin stammered, sniffling. I don't know. Look, you weren't there. You don't know what happened, so don't give me the third degree. Shino lost his arm, Shikamaru pointed out, unfurling several bandages, realizing it wasn't going to be enough for such a large wound. I really hope you're telling me the truth. The truth? Karin asked, raising her head from Shino to Shikamaru. The truth? Why would I lie? You've been giving me rude glares since this morning at the Chunin exams. Is this a reflection of your distrust for me? What could I possibly have done in the short time that you've known me to warrant such disgusting behavior? You were the only other one present when Ransai was speaking, Shikamaru reasoned. I can't make the correct choices without having the correct information. I think you need a lesson on respect, because I'm just as confused as you, Karin argued, forgetting the desperation of their situation in her frustration. Maybe you should take a second to help your teammates that you failed, instead of pointing fingers at the only other one still standing. Cursing under his breath, Shikamaru shook his head at her. No, I was just nothing, Karin interrupted. Look, well, we've met him before, Shino and I. He was so terrifying that I kind of blacked out. I can't remember what I said. Shikamaru's eyes narrowed as he worked busily to close the bleeding on Shino, and he slipped one hand inside his jacket to grip a kunai. What you said? That's everything for today. I didn't want this one to be pure combat, but when I got right down to it, it was practically inescapable. You'll also notice that I used Kikaichu instead of bug or beetles for Shino because it feels more specific. There are too many types of beetles and way too many types of bugs that I thought it was appropriate to use the right terminology. That said, these are the same bugs that he cultivated through the time skip. Nothing different except for name. Lots of bad news for the Leaf on this episode. Shikamaru and Karin are fine, but Tenten was brought to the brink and... yeah, you did not hear that wrong. Shino lost an arm. Karin was acting weird to say the least. Hopefully she didn't distract him long enough that he lost his arm because of her. I may have transitioned at a weird time there, and I recognize that, but basically Ransai just appeared in front of them. He's been getting stronger and stronger, and I wonder if there's a cap to this strength. I recently read about how Kishimoto apparently created Kaguya because, and I quote, Madara was too powerful to defeat. Are you getting this? So he created a more powerful entity to fix his power scaling problem. Good job, Kishimoto-senpai. What a mad mixture of logic. But I mention that because some of these characters might be reading as too powerful. We're into the Shippuden segment of my rewrite, and this villain has easily given the team of 4 a run for their money. But I also covered last episode that Ransai is about as strong as Nagato, and Nagato is stronger than in canon. Our heroes have made great strides towards power to stand up for their village. But at the end of the day, who will it be that can actually make this guy try? Stay tuned for that fun in a future episode. Until then, you know what's coming. The sky's the limit!